Okay, so for those of you who are worried we weren't going to talk about a lot of dirty politics, now we get to talk a lot about dirty politics. And so we're going to be talking about American political reform movement of the Gilded Age. So this period is going to take us basically from the end of the Civil War to 1900 or so politically. Some of it will be on the national scale. We'll talk about some presidents and some of what they're doing. Some of it, though, is going to be on the state and local level of what they're doing. So we're going to be dealing with this whole thing of these guys trying to sort of fix this leaky boat. For those of you who had American History 1, you'll also notice that a lot of this sort of links all the way back to Andrew Jackson. Yeah, that guy, who's causing problems even after he is rotting in his grave. So first guy we got to talk about is Ulysses S. Grant. Most of us remember Grant as the great Civil War general, and really, if he would have stopped there, he would be, an unremittent American hero. But he had to go on and be a politician and kind of tarnish his image. He's going to run for president. He's a Republican, and after the Civil War, you're sort of wasting your time in national politics being a Democrat. Democrats were the party of slavery. They were the party of secession. They were the party that basically gets tarred and feathered for causing the Civil War. And when you got 600,000 or so dead Americans, that's a tough legacy to live down. So Grant, he's going to run. He's going to be nominated by the Republicans in 1868, and he's going to win. And then 4 years later, he's going to win again, not because he's actually good at being president, because he's not. It's going to be the fact that he's Ulysses S. Grant, and he won the Civil War. And there was a lot of Americans that thought that they weren't going to win this. A lot of people in the North thought they weren't going to win the Civil War. So we've got to look at him as president, why his presidency sort of turns out the way that it does. All right. As I mentioned, he is widely respected as a general. He really was a great general. He figured out the cruel math that was necessary in order to defeat Robert E. Lee. You've got to go at him until he runs out of people. But a bunch of our guys are going to get shot. Yeah, that's life. You just got to deal with it. Okay, so he figured out the strategies that were going to be necessary to win sort of the Civil War in the last half of that. But generally speaking, he's got one of the worst presidencies, maybe the worst presidency, because of all the graft and corruption that takes place during his administration. There's a lot of people who steal. There's a lot of people who abuse power and authority for their own purposes or for purposes of their friends. Okay, during his administration. Now, one of the things that we got to point out very, very quickly is Grant was not dishonest himself. As far as anybody can tell, Grant was honest to a fault. He never stole so much as a penny from the U.S. Treasury. But he was a horrible judge of political character. As a general, you get these subordinate officers, they come in and say, all right, you're going to do this, and you're going to do that, and these are your orders, and you go do that. And if they don't do it, you fire them. You say, okay, you're relieved of command, and I'm putting somebody else in charge. And that's how it works in the Army. You get orders, and you say, yes, sir, and you go do it. Well, politics doesn't work quite like that. Even as President of the United States, you don't just get to tell people, all of them, what to do, especially not the ones in Congress. But even members of your administration, you have these discussions, okay, this is what we're going to do. Okay, yeah, Mr. President, yeah, I'll work on that, and then we'll see. Because they've got their own political allies within the party. The president isn't even necessarily the dictator of the executive branch. Okay, Grant's problem is he falls victim to this patronage system. If you took American History 1, we talked about this system before. We call it the spoils system under Andrew Jackson. But basically what you do is when you get elected, you turn around and all these jobs that you can hand out as the administration for, Postmaster General, Port Authority, tax collector. I mean, there's a lot of jobs in the federal government that you get hired for that you can turn around and you can give to basically anybody that you want. And what you do is you don't give them to people that are qualified. You give them to your political allies. You turn around to the people on the local level and say, hey, did you turn out votes for me? Yeah, I did. Well, here's this job. Hey, did you turn out votes for me nationally? Yeah, well, here's this job in the White House, or here's this job in the national government, okay? And so, now a lot of these people who were allies, political allies to Grant or the Republican Party, they really got their own motives for working for the Grant administration, and that was not because, I want to make America the best place possible, I'm going to turn my talents to national service. No, okay? It was because they wanted to make themselves and their friends rich, all right? Now, the economic consequences of this is going to be a massive economic downturn. All right. Like I said, basically every single major American economic recession, depression, panic, flippity outedness, whatever you want to call it, when the economy goes into the toilet, you can pretty much trace them all back to the government. Okay, the economy generally does pretty well by itself. It does sort of speed up and slow down. It does have a business cycle. Okay, but all of the big crashes, you can sort of point back and say, hey, did the government cause this? Yep, it sure did. Okay, and so this is going to be one of these problems that's going to take place eventually. All these guys sort of filching the federal money, handing out railroad contracts to friends when they really shouldn't have had them, doing sort of shady deals with banks. There's an attempt by some people to corner the market on gold. Grant has to then release money to try to deal with this, and so he's got a lot of dirty people in his administration. Eventually, this is going to create an economic depression, okay, known as the Panic of 1873. All right. So there's Grant. This is how we see him on the money. I've always sort of lobbied that Grant deserves to be on the currency because of his service to the nation in the Civil War. The problem is when you look at him on the money, he's wearing his president outfit and he's got his little bow tie, his little jacket. I think he should be in his uniform, from the Civil War because he was a pretty good Civil War general. He was a suck president though. So anyway, this is him. He's on the 50. For those of you who've never seen a $50 bill because you're a broke college student, hey, I've been there. This is what he looks like. Like I said, there he is in his little president outfit, which I don't know why we would want to award him this title and say, you were such a great guy, we're going to put you in the president outfit. So, anyway. It isn't just politics on the national level that are having a lot of problems, all right? Local municipal governments are just rife. They're rife with graft and corruption. And while we don't have time to talk about every single city and municipality and state in America, what we're going to do is we're going to pull one of these out, the most egregious example of these out, and use it as our case study to give you an idea of kind of what is going on in American cities. So we will be talking about Boss Tweed in New York City. You can sort of transpose this onto sort of any other place in America at this point. The Democrat Party political machine is going on in Chicago, the different ethnic groups that are sort of fighting for the political dominance in Boston at this point. It's all over the place in these municipalities all across America. All right, so the guy we're going to talk about is Boss Tweed. I think his name is Roscoe. So, if you're looking for boy names for your kid, Roscoe is one to think about. All right. So we look at this and the corruption that's going on at the local level, right? Because municipal leaders, they've got patronage to hand out too. You get elected mayor, you get elected city councilman, you get elected to these various positions. You've got some jobs, you've got some political influence that you can use as well. And so what they do is they skim this public money off that's supposed to be used for certain purposes, basically to enrich themselves, all right? That they're going to use this money to sort of use it for themselves, and then also to pay off political people to make sure that they get elected again. All right? They especially preyed on these immigrant groups, and we'll talk about how these immigrant groups are coming into America here in the late 19th, early 20th century. And they would lean on these people and say, hey, you want citizenship? You want jobs? You want participation in society? Oh yeah, well we can hook you up with all that. By the way, you need to vote for me. And if you don't, bad consequences for these guys. So, now of course a lot of these immigrant groups, they'd never gotten a chance to vote at all before anyway, so whatever, right? So this is a pretty good deal for these guys, except of course unless they want to swim against the stream and say, well, I really don't think you guys are the best candidates. I'm looking at some of these other guys in the political party. This is how you get beaten up, thrown out of your job, thrown out of your house, because some of these political operatives, they're pretty rough. Example of this, all right? So the worst example of all these guys was a guy named Boss Tweed, who ran the Tammany Hall political machine in New York City. All right? Tammany Hall was the mayor's mansion in New York City. And a political machine is really like any other machine. It's designed to crank out a product. Now, you go down to the Ford plant here in the early 1900s, that machine is designed to crank out cars. Model T. Political machine is designed to crank out votes. All right? The way that it works is you get your people elected to office. They skim off a lot of the money sort of for themselves, for their own political purposes, but they take also some of the other money and they turn around and they give it to the other people and they say, okay, here's some jobs for you, here's some jobs for you, here's some money to pass around for these guys, and you then go out and get more votes so that way we can get reelected next time. So you get the money, you use the money to get more votes, you use the votes to get back into power, and it becomes a cycle. Money, votes, money, votes, money, votes. And in some cases, it's just as simple as, hey, all right, you group of guys, you're going to vote for me 5 or 6 times a day, and every time we stop at a different place, you're going to give them a different fake name, and I'm going to buy a beer after we're done. In some cases, that's just how simple it was, okay? Well, Tweed skimmed millions and millions of dollars into his own pockets, okay? And he handed this patronage out to his supporters to make sure that he continued to get reelected. Now, Tweed made the mistake of getting too big for his own britches, which I guess is a good analogy because he was kind of fatty. But he got too big to go unnoticed anymore, and eventually he's caught. He's put in jail. I think he escapes from jail as well. I don't know how. Maybe I think he was too fat to squeeze through the bars. So, but whatever. But his case is pretty endemic of the rampant corruption that's going on here in American cities. And this is Thomas Nast, who was a political cartoonist here in the late 1800s, who had the courage to go after Boss Tweed when, of course, nobody else did. Because, I mean, Tweed is putting the police into power. They're not going to come after him. He's putting the judges into power. They're not going to, come after him. A lot of the lawyers and attorneys in the justice departments in these places, they're not going to come after him. And so, when federal investigators come in, they will, the question here at the bottom of the caption, who stole the people's money? And of course, they all sort of point at each other in a big circle. Well, it wasn't me. Now, all of these were real people. This is Boss Tweed, okay? This is him. And all of these, though, are other, like, actual real people. These are not just sort of caricatures of what people in New York might look like at this point. These are all actual political operatives of the Tammany Hall political machine that he's kind of caricatured to make them look like, doofuses. But even the ones that are facing the other way in the circle, he wrote their names on the back of their jackets, so that way you could tell exactly who they were. Nast had to go into hiding. I mean, he had a number of people after him as a result of the fact that he kind of kept this investigation going with his political cartoonery. This is another good example. There's Tweed and some of his cronies. Tweed is the Roman emperor, the Colosseum scene, and so instead of the tiger devouring the Christians, this is the Tammany tiger, you can tell on its little neck collar, is devouring Lady Liberty and Lady Justice, okay? And has ripped up, shreds of the Constitution, because it's not really a democratic, form of government. It's just these guys using the money and abusing the power and the authority to keep themselves in power. They're buying votes. They're paying these guys off with the patronage system. So this is his take on that. Well, when we deal with some of the bigger economic issues of the day, all right, one of the major businesses that we're going to talk a lot about when we deal with industrialization here in the late 19th century is the railroad business. The railroad business is one of the major fundamental social changers in American history. Okay, and we're going to see that following the Civil War, the railroad business is booming. Okay, the Civil War had really helped ignite the railroads and how important they were for transporting troops, transporting supplies, doing all the activity of the Civil War. And of course, railroad expansion meant that you could do that more and more on a civilian basis once the war was over, right? But of course, the problem with all this is Grant administration had financial mismanagement, which of course is going to deal in part with government handed out railroad contracts and dealing with banks. And I don't want to make this too complicated so that you're sitting there at your computer sort of going cross-eyed. But basically, long story short is the government's financial mismanagement is going to help touch off this panic in 1873. You've got one railroad company, which was sort of a fake railroad company that people had abused their government connections to gain investors, and then it causes the bank to fail when it fails, and then the other banks fail, and then the stock panic. So basically, that's what's going to take place. Is a lot of people put a lot of money in the railroad business, and because the government was basically saying, hey, this is great, you guys should do this, and it turns out that some of them are fake, or phony, or they're not exactly honest with their intentions because they've got friends in the Grant administration. Anyway, one goes bankrupt, and just like the tiny little crack in the dam, eventually the whole dam bursts, and that's exactly what's going to take place here. So Grant has to deal with this massive economic crash that takes place in his second term of office. And so Grant probably could have run for and won a third term, but like everybody after Washington until Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, decided to change that. No, I'm not going to run for a third term. Two's enough. I'm sick of being president. He was actually starting to get physically ill. He would eventually die of throat cancer, which is what happens when you drink too much and smoke too much in the 19th century. So His successor is Rutherford B. Hayes, and he was the one that, if you had American History 1, we talked about at the end of Reconstruction, he gained the presidency through some highly dubious fashions. For those of you who remember the 2000 election, 2000 election was actually pretty calm compared to the 1876 election, because once we finally got around to counting all the votes from the 2000 election, yeah, the guy that we said won, yeah, he actually won. It was pretty tight, but, you know, we counted the votes a bunch of times, and okay, yeah. We're never going to know who really won the 1876 election, because they took the votes into a locked room, and they were just like, okay, this group of votes says Tilden won, this group of votes says Hayes won, which one do we believe? That's a good one. And so, Hayes is going to win, okay? So as a result of that, he's really hindered by the fact that he had to do a lot of deals during the recount process. He had to start pulling in some favors. He kind of kicked into high gear, and a lot of people, especially Democrats, they're not gonna want to work with him, okay? And of course, the economic panic is a real albatross around the necks of the Republican Party. They're the party in charge, and what are we going to do about this massive economic panic? Hayes was a reformer, though. He wanted to see some changes here in this. And so he went after the most obvious and egregious form of corruption here in the federal government caused by this patronage system, which was the New York City tax house. All right, up until really the advent of the income tax here in the second decade of the 1900s, the number one way the federal government got money, other than selling land to civilians, was through import duties, tariffs on goods made in another country and shipped into the United States. And what you would do is you would stop at these tax houses, and they would look at your goods, and they would say, okay, you got this much stuff, you owe us this amount of taxes. So they would then pay them, and then they would take them to the tax house, and you've got to record all this. Well, if this seems like it's a pretty easy opportunity for people to steal money because you've got cash laying around on huge tables, that's because that's what it is, all right? And what you did was you put your people in charge of it. Republicans, if you're a Republican, you send Republican people in there, and they steal money, and they give a lot of it to the Republican Party. Perfect system, right? So, and the Democrats, when they win, they would do the same thing. The whole point of being in charge of the tax house was so you could steal money. So, Hayes decided to go after this. You got major charges of corruption that are going on in the New York tax house, okay? And so what he does is he sends this special investigator in and says, all right, you go in and you find out what's going on here, because I hear there's people stealing money. And we're going to prosecute these people. Oh, yes, sir, Mr. President. Goes down to New York City, checks all this stuff out, and comes back and says, well, there's a lot of stealing going on. Oh, let's go get them. Let's prosecute them. No, you don't understand, Mr. President. These guys are Republicans. And we're Republicans, so we can't go after these guys. Hayes does the one, right thing, two, not popular thing. Just because you're right doesn't mean you're going to be popular, all right? And he says, no, I don't care who the investigation hits. We're going to go after these guys. We're going to bring them up on charges, and we're going to clean out this. And so a lot of us here, from the safety of another century, can be, yeah, good for him, right? Clean out corruption, even if it's your own people, right? Show fair, even-handedness. Yeah, the effect of this was, yeah, they cleaned up the tax house fraud to a certain degree, but that also meant that basically now the Republicans had turned their backs on it as well. Oh, you're going to do that to us? No, I don't think so. So Hayes is going to spend his 4 sort of unhappy years as chief executive. The Democrats are mad at him for doing what they refer to as he stole the presidency from our guy. Maybe. The Republicans are going to be mad at him for, well, you're cutting into our, thievery, and you're trying to put our people in jail, which is sort of true. So Hayes isn't going to hang around very long. He tries to do the right thing, and he is severely punished for it. Here's a political cartoon of the Panic of 1873, all these railroad companies that kind of crash, and the explosion absorbs the entire city. It blows up the stock market, it blows up the banks, it blows up Main Street, and you can see that all the other activities with the railroad, pigs and cattle and all the other activities, they get blown up as well. So it gives you an idea of kind of how this political corruption leads to economic dislocation for everybody else. There's Rutherford B. Hayes, pretty cool looking guy. Like for the next several presidents, he's going to be a Civil War general, and you see the popularity of beard, right? Last guy to have facial hair as president of the United States was William Howard Taft, and all he had was a mustache. So we're due, right? We're due for somebody with a beard. So our next person is going to be James Garfield, all right? the Republican Party at this point, by 1880, is really kind of at a crossroads, and it's split kind of into two camps. All right, you've got your mugwumps, which is one of the great sort of political nicknames of all time, and they're the reformers. All right, these are the Republicans that are kind of looking at this, and they kind of agree with Hayes, and they say, okay, we really need to make some changes. We need to clean up government. You know, we need to get in there. This is getting to be a bad kind of problem. But then you had the other group of Republicans who were like, no, if we stop buying votes, if we stop handing out patronage, then we're going to lose elections. And then the Democrats are just going to win all the time. And they don't seem to have any compunction about buying votes and handing out patronage and doing the dirty, corrupt stuff. So what good is it for us to say, well, we're going to be honest and out of power? So you had the stalwarts who kind of had the opposite position, which is you got to do what you got to do if you're going to win. So they go to this convention in 1880, and you get these two factions, and they're almost ready to come to blows. I mean, it's just ugly. Okay, so eventually the convention decides to nominate Garfield as their presidential nominee in 1880. All right, he's a reformer. So to balance out the ticket, they're going to put as vice president Chester A. Arthur. He's a stalwart. He represents that wing of the Republican Party. Okay, so this is something that the Republicans kind of compromise on. And long story short, all right, like I said, the Republicans, they do a pretty good job for a long time of blaming the Democrats for causing the Civil War. So in 1880, James Garfield, he's going to win. All right, he's going to win the presidency. All right, and Garfield, for his part, he's dealing with some of these people that are coming in, and they're trying to get these jobs in federal government. Hey, I got votes for you in Ohio. Hey, I got votes for you in New York. I got votes for you here. Garfield generally, okay, I'm not doing it that way. We're going to appoint people that I think are qualified. All right. One of these guys that Garfield finds to be not qualified is a mildly crazy stalwart named Guteau. Okay? He tries to get a job, I think, in the Justice Department or something like that. And of course, Garfield, no. Well, why not? You know, I supported you, I voted for you, I got votes, blah, blah, blah. We don't hire crazy people. And there was something wrong with Guteau. He wasn't all there. Okay? And so Garfield says, I'm sorry, we're not gonna hire you. And so 6 months into his term, Garfield's at the train station. He's getting ready to board the train when Guteau comes up behind him and puts a bullet into him. And as they're sort of wrestling him to the ground, what'd you shoot the president for? What'd you shoot the president for? And he says, because I am a stalwart and Arthur will be president. So you blow away the reformer, and the vice president is supposed to be the non-reform guy. Well, he's going to be president now. Right? This is how crazy people think, for those of you who have never been crazy before. All right? So this is the idea. He wanted Arthur to be president, and so the best way to do this was to murder the current occupant. All right? Garfield would die from the gunshot wound 11 agonizing weeks later. Okay? You don't have modern antibiotics. It was actually, if you read about it, pretty painful way to go because the infection spread in his body. So anyway, less said about that, the better. All right? For those of you who have never seen a president shot in the back, this is an artist's rendition of what it would look like. Here's the president, here's the guy shooting him, and here's the bullet. Okay? So it just comes right up on him and blows him away. This is Garfield. For those of you who wondered, what an absurd name for a lasagna-loving orange cat. It's actually the name of a president. All right? So, you're Chester Alan Arthur. Life's looking good for you. You get to be president of the United States. You get to go from one of the most worthless jobs in America, which is vice president, because you don't really do anything as vice president. And you get to be the most important guy in the federal government, which is president of the United States. But as you go in your office, you get to sit down in the chair that the guy who was in charge, he got murdered because the political system around him was dirty. So a lot of people, though, when Arthur becomes president, a lot of people within the Republican Party and a lot of people around him, they expect him to do the opposite of what Garfield done. He's going to hand out patronage. He's going to do the things that it takes. He's going to hand out money. He's going to hand out jobs. And he's going to do this, what we thought he was going to do. But Garfield's death had really shocked the nation. And probably had shocked Chester A. Arthur, who now has to sit in the chair of the guy who got murdered. So this is a sobering kind of moment. Arthur becomes a pretty fervent reformer. He comes out of kind of seclusion, and he really has changed his political stripes. He prosecuted a number of these fraud cases, people that were working in the federal government and were stealing, and he pushed for a reform bill from Congress. He says, listen, we've got to change the way that we're doing this. Garfield's death is going to spur these guys that normally were perfectly willing to kind of sit on their hands into action. And they're going to pass the Pendleton Act. All right? It ended. It did a bunch of different things. But one, it ended the practice of forcing these federal employees to make campaign contributions out of their wages. The idea was, hey, you get nominated by a Republican, and if you want to keep that job, then you have to give some of that money back to the Republican Party or the Democrat Party, depending on which party put you in there. And if you didn't like it, you got fired. So essentially, it's a money laundering deal, right? You just take some of the treasury money, you give it to an employee, but you're going to force them to give it to the party. So it's not really a campaign contribution. It's just, a forcible way to steal some of the treasury. Okay. Two, it made a lot of these federal jobs that aren't really politically appointed. I mean, does it matter whether your mailman is a Democrat or a Republican? I mean, can't either of those people hand out letters just as equally good? So a lot of these federal jobs that aren't dependent upon you making policy decisions, make them attainable by competitive examinations rather than political appointments. So what that meant was a huge swath of these federal jobs aren't going to be hired by political people. So you then don't have to worry about his patronage as much. Now, this isn't going to completely fix the problem, but it's a major, major step towards getting away from at least an open system where here's some money, here's some jobs, go get me some votes. And then you turn around, hey, I've got some money now, here's some money, here's some jobs, go get me some votes. And so what you're seeing here is trying to break up that system, at least on the federal level. So there's Chester A. Arthur, massive mutton chop sideburns, not quite as big as Ambrose Burnside's, but it's tough to dethrone the king. So there he is taking the oath of office after Garfield has finally succumbed. This is the Pendleton Act. This is back when acts of Congress could fit on one handwritten page. For those of you who know anything about federal legislation now, good God, if we can only go back to that. This is the actual bill in the National Archives. This is an image of it to give you an idea of kind of what these look like. All right. Now, the next three elections after this are pretty close, just like the four previous ones. Congress is actually going to change parties 6 times, back and forth between the Democrats. Okay. And Grover Cleveland is going to be the first Democrat who's going to win the White House in 1884, and since the last Democrat had left office in early 1861 on the eve of the Civil War. So as Abraham Lincoln is coming in 1861, Buchanan is the last Democrat to hold the office. It had been Republicans from 1861 all the way until Grover Cleveland's inauguration in 1885. So pretty long stretch of uninterrupted Republicans. All right. Grover Cleveland, though, interestingly enough, is the last small government conservative Democrat to be president of the United States. Very, very different than what you'll see sort of modern 20th and 21st century Democrats are. Big government, government can do great things, kind of thinking. Grover Cleveland comes into office, and the issues that he's trying to deal with is the government by itself is too powerful. If you want to try to reform the government, give it less authority, give it less power. And this will help in a lot of ways. Right? One of the things that he was trying to work on was to try to lower the tariff. Ever increasingly, he felt that this tax on imports was just a sop to big business. That the industrial giant captains of industry had kind of finagled their way into the halls of power and were using this to artificially raise prices for their foreign competitors, which just meant sort of free profits for them on the backs of the American consumer who had to pay artificially higher prices. So this tariff money, if we get rid of it, then we won't have as much money to argue about, right? And overall, generally speaking, we're going to shrink the size and scope of the federal government. Well, this is going to upset a lot of these business leaders, right? They don't like having their cheese moved. They don't like having their opportunity to funnel money to themselves. And so the re-election campaign that you're going to have with Grover Cleveland is you've got an election with some real issues on what's going to take place. Do we want this small, shrunk federal government, or do we want this government that's going to continue to hand out patronage? And of course, the Republicans are wavering back and forth between do we want reform, do we not want reform, this kind of thing. Cleveland is going to lose his job to Benjamin Harrison in 1888. Harrison was one of these big government Republicans. He had no problem with this. One of the major areas that you're going to see here by the late 1880s and the early 1890s, a lot of these Civil War vets who had served in the Civil War 30 years previously, they're getting on up there in years. You know, if you were 30 years old in the Civil War, well, you're 60 by this point. If you were in your 20s, you're in your 50s at this point. So these guys get pretty close to retirement age. And one of the things the government had set up for these Union veterans was a pension program. Wasn't a whole lot of money, but, you know, every little dollar helps. And it actually, when you look at it on a national scale, you're going to pay off all these Union veterans. That's a lot of money. That's a pretty sizable chunk of the federal budget. And so Harrison was pals with these guys. The Union, it was the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR. It was the Union Army Veterans Association. And, oh, you guys want money? Here. I'll shovel money at you. No, you got a hangnail from the war. Oh, here, have some money. I mean, some of these were legitimate, but a lot of these were pretty egregious. To where basically he put a guy who had been the leader of the Grand Army of the Republic and made him the Veterans Administrator. The guy who used to advocate for, you need to give us more money, is put in charge of the program of handing out money to former soldiers. A lot of graft, a lot of corruption takes place as a result of that. He's going to hand out money to these people. He's going to hand out money to supporters. And don't think that they don't get the idea. Hey, you like having the money coming in? Yeah, you need to vote for the people that are handing it back out. That's the way money from the government goes. Okay? If you don't believe me, anytime anybody proposes ever cutting some program, is they go and they find the people that are on that program and they say, hey, the other guy, he wants to cut your program. You're going to be out on the streets eating, dog food or whatever. That's how you do it. That's how you get those people to not vote for them. Okay? And of course, if you're going to pass out all this money, you need cash. So you increase the tariff in order to raise the revenue in order to do this. So the big business people, yeah, more money for us, more money for the government, hand all this stuff out. So Benjamin Harrison is going to be the guy to do this. All right, there's Grover Cleveland, who looks like sort of what a linebacker maybe would look like in the late 19th century if they had that kind of thing. So he is often referred to as bull-necked. And if you can see the photo clearly, yep, there you go. This is the 1884 election. Really, really close. Cleveland is going to get 48.5% of the popular vote, and James G. Blaine from the state of Maine is going to get 48.25%. So a quarter of a percent is the difference in the popular vote. The Electoral College is a little off in Grover Cleveland's favor, but that's what's going to take place here. And then he is replaced by Benjamin Harrison. So there you go. Right? Give you an idea of what this guy looks like, who's then going to pass out all this money. And you can see that in 1888, that's the same electoral map, isn't it? Nope. New York has traded places. Okay, and so this is again one of these times when the winner of the popular vote, Cleveland, he wins 49 to 48. He loses the Electoral College vote because he can't get enough states to vote for him. And New York, and just to give you an idea, there are rampant charges in 1888 of corruption in New York. Just that Benjamin Harrison stole the election in New York by buying votes and all this kind of stuff. And sure, why not, right? But the end result is he loses. But Grover Cleveland's going to come back. He's the only person to serve 2 terms non-consecutively as president of the United States, and this is him from his second term. And so you can see again that now New York has gone back into the Republicans' column with this. And we'll also see, and we'll talk about one of the later sections, the populists are beginning to make a little bit of electoral noise here in the 1892 election as well. And then there's lovable furry old Grover, for those of you who are fans of Sesame Street. So yeah, we get a little bit of a popular cartoonery from this era. We get Garfield the cat, we get Grover the Muppet. So anyway, that's what's going on here as well. So now we get Grover Cleveland Part 2. And this really gives us a nice little insight into kind of what's going on, how these political parties change. And like with Hayes, what happens when you do the right thing and when the right thing is the unpopular thing? So Grover Cleveland is going to run into this, okay? He's going to come back in 1892 and he's going to win, all right? He gets his political party, Democrats are a little better organized. I don't know if they out-cheat the Republicans in New York, but I mean, whatever, right? Long story short is he's going to win and he's going to come back. The problem is, though, the presidency of 1893 is a lot different than the one that he left it 4 years before, okay? Like we had seen before here, when the government gets involved in the economy, spending a lot of money, raising tariffs, and doing all this kind of stuff, it always leads to disastrous consequences. And so, in this case, we get disastrous consequence 1893, or what they call the Panic of 1893. So instead of coming into a government where it's washed with money and there's all this surplus funds and it's such a sore temptation to hand this out to political patrons and what do we do with all of this, now he's got a very different kind of thing, which the government doesn't have enough money, the economy's in a depression, businesses are laying off people, a lot of them are going bankrupt, banks are failing, they're sucking down people's life savings into this sort of bottomless pit. This is the situation that he's got to deal with, okay? So Cleveland faces a very large deficit. This is back when the government actually cared whether or not it spent more money than it had. So it faces a very large deficit, which is that money coming into the federal government doesn't look like it's going to be able to cover its expenses. And of course, you can't tax the people very much because a lot of them are unemployed. You can't take money from people who don't have money. And of course, an ever-depleting amount of gold reserves that they had used to try to float their way through the previous administration, because Benjamin Harrison, he just kind of handed out money. And when you hand out enough money, you eventually run out of money. So Cleveland was looking at this and saying, how do we patch up things to make our way through the next 4 years? So what he does is he works out a bond deal with a bunch of Wall Street bankers. And he gets with these guys like J.P. Morgan. He says, hey, look, you need to bail the federal government out. That'll keep us operating. That'll keep the economy kind of operating. And so he works out this deal where they're going to loan them money and they're going to pay them off as things go by. And it works, okay? It works. The problem is, though, you know what happens when you borrow money from a bank? It makes money. That's how they make their money, all right? That's sort of like, when you go down to McDonald's and you buy lunch. They made a profit off of that lunch. Yeah, they did. That's how they make their money, is they sell you hamburgers and then you get, they make money. Well, when bankers loan money and they get paid back with interest, they make a profit. Well, what you're seeing here is kind of the walleye vision of a lot of people that are so anti-corporate in America, especially in sort of populist quarters, is J.P. Morgan made $15 million off of bailing out the government. He's this dirty kind of hack that's just using the federal government for this kind of his own enrichment. Well, he actually didn't make a whole lot of money, and he did help save the nation. When you consider how much he kind of put the different banking industries together. But you're never ever going to get people to feel bad for a rich guy. You're never going to feel that, people, the rich guy is really heroic in the way to save the nation. No, he's a rich guy, and therefore he's a jerk. So Cleveland, by extension then, I thought you were on our side, Cleveland. I thought that you were going to you're going to control these guys. You dealt with these robber barons, these evil Wall Street guys. How could you? Of course, Cleveland, I saved the nation from dissolution and bankruptcy. But you dealt with the bad guys. So anyway, that's what's going to happen here is this is going to cost Cleveland a lot of political support. It's going to bleed over then into the Democrat Party because it makes them all look dirty, right? People also blame Cleveland for an inadequate response to the Depression. Hey, what are you going to do about the Depression? Cleveland's like, I'm not going to do anything. Why? Do you people not see what happens when the government tries to get involved in the economy? It makes it worse. Perception is one thing, and reality is the other one. Cleveland's dealing with reality. The government gets involved in the economy too much, all it does is push it over a cliff. All right? People see that, well, Cleveland, he doesn't care. Democrats, they don't care. So, that's the idea. And of course, Cleveland's absolutely right. When we get to the 1930s, we're going to see what a guy who supposedly cares about the economy does. We're going to have a very active government. We're going to fix this depression. All he did was make it last a decade longer. But he looked like he cared, and he gets reelected. So all of this, when you put this together, and this is kind of the overall theme for what we're going to be talking about from, kind of the last quarter, 1876 or so to 1900. This period was one of attempted reform, when you look at it in kind of the rearview mirror. Now, some of these reforms are going to stick, although with some holes, like the Pendleton Act. Patronage still remains a problem, especially on the local level. All right? Now, some reforms, like tariffs, where they're trying to get this fixed, is going to fail miserably. All right, the government's raking in huge amounts of money just to hand it out to political supporters, and of course to prop up some of these business industries that are getting a prop from these tariffs. Now, some of the most corrupt members of society, like Tweed, are caught and jailed and reined in. Well, corruption isn't going to disappear from local politics. Some of it's going to continue on into the 1900s. It'll decrease somewhat, and I want to tell you, when you go today and say, well, municipalities are not corrupt today, because they kind of are, but nothing like they were in the late 19th century. Just not nearly as bad. I mean, it was just sort of blatant, vote buying was going on left and right. So now, in the background of all these political changes, you've got a number of social changes between rural and urban facets of American life, and that, though, is something for next time. So that is it for